Hi everyone and welcome to Isamu Rat Care. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about quarantining, and I'm going to try and talk about why we quarantine, what it is, and also how we go about it, and the kind of different levels of quarantine, and I want to kind of explain that. So what is quarantine? Essentially it is trying to kind of protect our existing rats as fingers? No, not fingers, Snufkin, fingers in my hands. As Snufkin is demonstrating, we want to look after our rats. We want to make sure they're safe from various infectious illnesses, and there are several different types of things that could be passed from rat to rat. So it's something sorry, Molly's hanging by her paws. She's okay. She's also slightly pregnant, so it doesn't help. So we want to protect our existing rats from the risk of illnesses and problems that they can pick up from other rats. So these means rats that we're basically taking into our home. Those could be new rats, they could be temporary foster rats, they could be kind of rats that are just stopping overnight as holiday guests, that kind of thing. But either way, we want that kind of level of protection for our own rats to those. We don't want them picking up anything, because ultimately we do need to look after our rats, and it's one of the ways we can do that. So, when do you quarantine? So quarantine, as with a lot of things in rats, is all about a risk assessment. So when we're thinking about whether to quarantine or not, we need to decide the level of risk that the rats that we're potentially taking in represent to our own rats. And we do that by thinking about things like what are the chances of these new rats having been in contact or in the same airspace as other rats, or actually in some cases other animals, particularly where there's a fast turnover of other animals. So the more that they've been in the kind of same environment of lots of different animals, the higher risk they represent. And for instance, a good example of this is a rat in a pet shop, be they in the adoption section or be they in the actual main pet shops themselves. So they're in an environment where new animals are coming in and out rapidly. They're coming from rodent farms, which are large scale breeding colonies, so they have a rapid turnover of rats as well. And so when there are issues, those kind of rats, it kind of gets passed around very easily, and often the places like the pet shops won't actually realise the rats are ill until it's too late, and then it's been passed on to other animals. It will lurk and be kind of held in their system before they start showing symptoms. So you don't know that you've got a problem until probably sometimes a couple of weeks, sometimes even longer than that, as it spreads slowly through a large area and several different groups. So they're kind of like really high risk rats, and you might find as well some kind of rescues where they're often taking in animals and kind of giving them back out again and so on. Again, high turnover of different animals, particularly where there's lots of rats going through that. To be fair, most large rescues don't have a massively fast turnover of rats unless they quarantine themselves, and some do. So that's one to consider, and it's actually in some ways the same for some breeders. If you go into a lot of different shows, though generally speaking people that go along to shows are usually better educated and try not to take risks with other people's rats, but it can happen. So that's one thing to bear in mind. When you're getting rats from another breeder, it's worth having a chat to them. They should understand and be honest about their level of risk. So I will always be upfront with anybody that asks me about the risks for their kittens, and they will help you understand that and make the call. Very low risk options are things like when you get rats from somebody, let's say they've kept rats for 6 months and they're looking to rehome them. They've never had any other rats, they've got no other animals in the house, they haven't been to the vets recently. They're really low risk. Those rats, if they're going to be carrying something infectious, should have been showing it many weeks beforehand. In fact, they should be over the infectious period for the majority of issues. So that kind of gives you a level of the kind of understanding of the risk. It's very much a personal call. I can't tell you what the right answer is. I know personally that high risk rats I would always quarantine. They wouldn't be allowed in my rat room for quite some time. And I would probably not quarantine from other breeders that I trust and know well and understand their level of risk. So that kind of gives you a bit of a feel for it, but it is a personal call, so don't let anybody push you to do something you don't feel comfortable with. I have pet homes that choose to quarantine rats from me, and that is absolutely fine. I kind of fully support them in that decision. It's very much kind of a personal thing. So the next thing is how to quarantine. And to understand that, we need to understand the different ways that illnesses can be kind of spread, and I'll start with the kind of what I would call the lowest level of quarantine that you may do. So a kind of really low level of quarantine is when you get new rats, you keep them in a separate cage in the same room. So this kind of helps protect the rats from any illnesses or issues that they might get by direct contact with other rats, and there are some. So you can get things like staph, which is a form of kind of skin infection, which we can get to, ringworm, etc. In fact, I will say majority of the issues that get transferred between rats in the way of kind of ringworm and staph come for us originally, and actually we may have spread it to other rats as well. So that's one to bear in mind. There's also some things that can be spread by fecal oral route, which is a very fancy way of saying rats eating each other's poo, which they do, and it's perfectly healthy for them to do. Unless there's some sort of parasites or similar that are held in the kind of droppings. And I've seen a really nasty spate of abscesses, this was quite a few years ago, that were kind of really unusual bacteria that actually spread by that route. So the person was perfectly fine keeping rats actually effectively in the same cage but split, but keeping the infected rats on the bottom, and then the ones at the top didn't get it, so there's no chance of the poo dropping through. So this is kind of one of the things to kind of understand. Now, technically, the further the distance is between the two cages, the kind of more you're increasing that gap and decreasing the level of risk from kind of direct contact or more indirect contact. But you need to bear in mind that you can spread things between them, so make sure that you're kind of washing your hands between groups, and ideally actually also taking off or changing your top layer. And a good way to do this is always go to see your own rats first, handle them, fuss them, have a great time, then go and see the other rats, because you're not likely to pass something from your group of rats, which is effectively quarantined, to the rats that are in the quarantine, but you can pass it the other way. So always try and do that. So the next kind of level of quarantine is what I would call moderate, mid-level, and that is you're still in the same building, but actually you've got the rats, the kind of new rats, in a completely different room, and there's ideally a couple of doors between them. Even better if one group's upstairs and the other group's downstairs. The key thing there is distance, and also the kind of doors between them, because that helps limit the spread of more kind of airborne issues. So one of the common ways that some of the particularly nasty things are spread is airborne droplets, and that is effectively like the common cold. An infected rat will sneeze, and then the droplets will toodle along until another rat inhales them, and then that will get into the lungs and cause the infection to kind of take home, depending on the wellness of the rat involved and kind of the level of infectiousness of the issue. So if you can have rats, let's say your group downstairs and the other group upstairs, or vice versa, you're putting a couple of effectively airlocks between it. It's not perfect. It's still perfectly possible when you open the doors, some of those droplets will go in the hallways, and then when you open the next door, it could go in, but it reduces the risk. It doesn't remove it, it reduces it. So it helps. It's better than nothing, and it's better than them staying in the same room. And that's something that you need to bear in mind. There isn't a point of just doing full quarantine, and I see this quite a lot online, and this is where a lot of misconceptions come in. The idea that if you don't quarantine fully, then there's no point quarantine at all, you might as well just stick them in a cage and everybody be happy. But no, that's completely wrong. Any level of quarantine is better than none, and it will help kind of reduce the risk. In an ideal world, you'd do a full quarantine, and that would reduce the risk substantially. Sorry, Mog was trying to take my cushion and fall on the floor with it. But yes, so any level is better than nothing, and the kind of higher up the level of hierarchy you can get, the better. So we've now got them in separate rooms. Again, you really want to do the same thing as I was talking about before, whereas you see your own rats first, then go and see the newcomers, and take off your top layer of clothes and wash your hands down afterwards. Then we get into full quarantine. Full quarantine is what we term separate airspace. So separate airspace means you have to go outside before you go into the next place. So I effectively have a full quarantine option here, because my rat room is in the converted garage. I have to go outside and then through the conservatory and into the house back home. So I have separate airspace. I can put rats in the house, though the downside of that option is that I obviously live in the house most of the time, so I will come from the kind of potential quarantine airspace into the rat room. In an ideal world, you'd kind of have another option that was outside, or they'd stay over at a friend's house. I have done that before. My parents once quarantined a foster rat for a couple of weeks for me before I could pick him up, and it worked really well. So that is like the easiest option, is just to ask a friend or a kind of neighbour or your parents to rat sit for you for a period of time, somebody that doesn't have rats themselves. So that is helpful, or you can do something where you juggle it yourself, and I have done that before. So when you're doing this separate airspace, and particularly where you know there's an issue, then you will go into ultra high kind of level of quarantine. So I once had to do this. One of my friends' rats group got a really nasty virus, and we're talking she lost half her rats. And at some point I'll do a video on viruses, I think, because it might be quite interesting and useful for people. But this virus was incredibly infectious, but it didn't survive on surfaces particularly long. It's kind of like a few hours and you're okay, which made it a little bit easier. So what effectively I had to do with my rat group was I would have to make sure I seated them first, and then I would go over to help her with her rats. And then when I came back, I would not go near the rat room. I'd go straight in the house, shower, change clothes. I actually ended up having a quarantine set of clothes which I would use for her place, which worked really well. And it's even down to stuff you don't think about, like my watch. It suddenly occurred to me as I was kind of showering the first time that my watch is something that I wear everywhere, and I hadn't done anything. So I actually started taking my watch off before I went to see her. I could give it a bit of a wipe down with some proper kind of antiviricide type stuff if I wanted to. I mean, I did that first time, but it was easier for me to just not take it when I was going into that situation, so I didn't have to think about it. But the full kind of shower will help wash stuff off. So I was washing my hands. I remember a vet friend once saying, empty your nose, because you hold a lot of airborne droplets in there. That's the nose's purpose. Little things that you don't think about. I would not necessarily go to that extreme level of effort unless you really do know that there's an issue, because it was a lot of faff. Some nights when I went to see her rats straight from work, then I would have to get my husband to look after my rats for that night, because I couldn't go into the rat room. I couldn't risk my rats like that, because it was a really kind of nasty virus. And as it was, I visited several times and my rats were absolutely fine, so we got away with it. But it kind of shows that you can do that. You can do that level. I wouldn't have wanted to sustain it for a long period of time, and it would be quite difficult if I had rats in the house, for instance, that were quarantining and they then fell ill, and how I balance it with these, but I'd make it work. In fact, I'd probably send my rats up to somebody else for that period, because it would be less risky for them. Send them down to my parents, they can look after the grand rats. But yes, so that's the kind of thing you need to think about. So that kind of shows you the different levels of quarantine that you can achieve, from down to the not keeping them in the same cage initially, and that protects against kind of contact stuff, it protects against parasites, and so on. I should briefly mention, because it's an interesting one, quarantining bedding. It's something that I hadn't realised that I do, but do. When I haven't had a louse outbreak in my rats for years now, and I found it like strange, because lots of people are going, well, I use that bedding and it quite often has lice in it. And I was like, oh, I use it all the time and I've never had a problem. And then I realised what I'm effectively doing is quarantining my bedding, because I don't clean my rats out hugely often. I don't need to. The setup means that they kind of keep clean very, very well, and it's underpopulated and good absorbent stuff, no nasty plastic shelves, etc. So it's like about 3 weeks between my clean outs. So when I run out of substrate, I'll get the next bedding bale in. In fact, more often actually, I get the next bedding bale in before I run out of substrate, just in case. And then of course it can be like 6 weeks plus before I end up using it. And that effectively means the bale's been sat in my rat wardrobe for a good probably couple of months before I actually end up using it. A louse life cycle is only 3 weeks. So basically they've got no food and they die, and I don't have any lice problems, so that's quite a useful one. Not directly rat quarantine, but a little tip that I didn't realise I was doing until recently. Watch me now get lice in the next week or two, because Sod's Law says that after saying that I deserve it. But I thought it might be interesting for you anyway. Yeah, so we've talked about keeping them in separate cages as a really low level quarantine. keeping them in separate rooms, ideally split by at least 2 doors, or even different levels of the house, far away as possible, as a kind of good intermediate level of quarantine. Again, making sure that you're changing top surfaces of your clothes and wiping down your hands and such, and you see your rats first and then the new rats. And then the kind of more full-blown quarantine where you keep them in a separate airspace, so separated by the outdoors, ideally at a friend's house that doesn't keep rats, or actually other animals to some degree. And then the kind of final full-blown quarantine when you know there's an issue, where you're literally kind of changing all your clothing, you're kind of having a full shower, you're emptying your nose before you go kind of back to your rats. And actually I would sleep on it overnight, just so that gave it a good kind of 8 hours before I saw my rats again, and that kind of gave me a bit of a buffer and was quite useful. But yeah, so that gives you a bit of an understanding of it. Remember, do your risk assessment, decide what level of risk you're happy with, and you're happy for your rats to go with, bearing in mind that some of these issues can kill. And even if they don't kill, they can be bloody uncomfortable for the rats involved and expensive in terms of vet bills and so on. But yes, so think around that, make your decisions and stick with it. Don't just think, because I can't do full quarantine, I shouldn't bother at all. And you'll do okay with that. So that's it from me. Any questions, feel free to add on to wherever you're watching, whether it be on my page or on YouTube, and I will try and answer them. So bye for now.